From New York, this is Democracy Now!
War in Afghanistan was never meant to be a multi-generational undertaking. We were attacked. We went to war with clear goals. We achieved those objectives. Bin Laden is dead, and al-Qaeda is degraded in Iraq and Afghanistan. And it's time to end the forever war.
President Biden's vow to withdraw U.S. troops from Afghanistan by September 11th, ending the longest war in U.S. history. But will the U.S. keep special operations troops and CIA operatives inside Afghanistan? We'll hear part of Biden's speech and talk to Congressman Ro Khanna about U.S. policy in Afghanistan, Iran, Yemen, and more. Then we look at setbacks in the nation's COVID-19 vaccination rollout as the CDC temporarily pauses the use of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine over concerns about rare blood clots.
This is a very rare event, one in more than 1 million individuals. The J&J vaccine has been shown in clinical trials to be highly efficacious. What we're talking about now has nothing to do with the efficacy of the vaccine.
We'll speak to Dr. Monica Gandhi about vaccines, vaccine equity, masks, and more. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. President Biden's vow to withdraw U.S. troops from Afghanistan by September 11th, the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks. In a speech Wednesday, Biden said it's time to end what he described as the, quote, forever war.
We delivered justice to bin Laden a decade ago, and we've stayed in Afghanistan for a decade since. Since then, our reasons for remaining in Afghanistan have become increasingly unclear.
Despite Biden's remarks, the New York Times reports the United States is expected to keep relying on a, quote, shadowy combination of clandestine special operations forces, Pentagon contractors, and covert intelligence operatives inside Afghanistan after September. Following his speech, Biden traveled to Arlington National Cemetery to visit the graves of soldiers lost in Afghanistan. Meanwhile, Secretary of State Tony Blinken has just arrived in Afghanistan on an unannounced trip. After headlines, we'll speak to Democratic Congressmember Ro Khanna of California, who's also calling for a reduction of the military budget. A warning to our audience, the next stories contain graphic footage and descriptions of police violence. In Minnesota, the Brooklyn Center police officer who shot and killed 20-year-old Dante Wright during a traffic stop Sunday has been arrested on a charge of second-degree manslaughter. If convicted, Kimberly Potter faces up to 10 years in prison and a $20,000 fine. Potter was released from jail after posting a $100,000 bond. Body cam video footage shows Potter pointing her 9mm pistol at Wright, repeatedly shouting, "Taser," before firing a single bullet into Wright's chest. The taser remained holstered beside her non-dominant hand. The weapon is a bright yellow color and has a different grip. Potter is a 26-year police veteran who was training other officers when she shot Wright. She'll be charged in Washington County, east of the Twin Cities. Hennepin County prosecutor Mike Freeman said the change in jurisdiction was to avoid any appearance of a conflict of interest. For a fourth straight night, protesters surrounded the Brooklyn Center Police Department demanding justice. Police fired tear gas, rubber bullets, stun grenades, and pepper spray at protesters, once again violating a prohibition on the use of such force passed by the City Council Monday. The Minnesota State Patrol said 24 people were arrested overnight. A few miles south of Brooklyn Center, the murder trial of Derek Chauvin continues today, with speculation growing over whether the former Minneapolis police officer will take the stand in his own defense. On Wednesday, a forensic pathologist called by Chauvin's lawyers testified George Floyd died of heart trouble rather than a lack of oxygen. Dr. David Fowler, the former chief medical examiner for the state of Maryland, dismissed an official autopsy report that found Floyd died of cardiopulmonary arrest due to restraint and neck compression. Video of Floyd's death shows Chauvin kneeling on Floyd's Floyd's neck for over 9 minutes, including for several minutes after Floyd stopped responding. But Dr. Fowler claimed Floyd died from a combination of heart disease, drug use, and tailpipe emissions from the police cruiser.
There is exposure to a vehicle exhaust, so potentially carbon monoxide poisoning.
Under cross-examination, Dr. Fowler admitted there was no evidence of carbon monoxide in George Floyd's blood. He also conceded George Floyd should have been given medical attention and might have survived if officers had rendered aid. Dr. Fowler is being sued by the family of 19-year-old Anton Black, an African-American teenager from Maryland who died in 2018 after he was electrocuted with a taser, pinned in a prone position, and crushed under the weight of 3 white police officers and a white civilian as he struggled to breathe and lost consciousness. Black died on the front porch of his mother's home as she was forced to stand by watching. After an autopsy, Dr. Fowler ruled Black's death an accident, and no one was charged with a crime. The wrongful death lawsuit says Dr. Fowler delayed release of an autopsy report for months and covered up police responsibility for Black's death. Black's sister, LaToya Holly, said this week, quote, "It's surreal that you have 2 men on the opposite sides of the country that experienced almost the same treatment by 2 different police officers. The medical examiner, in my opinion, was egregious in the way he finalized Anton's autopsy results. Now he's being called to be an expert witness for another police officer," she said. The New York Police Department's under fire after officers were spotted once again deploying a high-tech surveillance robot, this time during an arrest at a Manhattan public housing complex. On Monday, a bystander filmed as members of NYPD's Technical Assistance Response Unit escorted a 4-legged robot studded with sensors, lights, and cameras out of a high-rise apartment. The robot, produced by Boston Dynamics, is as large as a medium-sized dog and can navigate autonomously. New York Congressmember Jamal Bowman blasted the city's use of police robots in a video posted on Twitter.
Now, not only do I feel physically occupied in my community by too many police, now y'all bring in robot police to occupy my community? So you can't give me a living wage. You can't raise the minimum wage. You can't give me affordable housing. I'm working hard. I can't get paid leave. I can't get affordable child care. Instead, we got money, taxpayer money, going towards robot police dogs.
Meanwhile, in Boston, acting Boston Mayor Kim Janey has ordered the release of documents related to former Boston Police Union Chief Patrick Rose, who was first accused of child sexual abuse in 1995, yet was allowed to remain on the force for over 20 more years, abusing other children. The Boston Globe found the Boston Police Department concluded Rose likely was guilty of sexually abusing a 12-year-old boy in 1995, but took no action. Last year, a teenage girl reported she was abused by Rose from the age of 7 through 12, leading to at least 5 more survivors coming forward. In Maryland, 16-year-old Peyton Alexander Ham died Tuesday after he was fatally shot by a state trooper in St. Mary's County. Few details of Ham's killing have emerged, but police cited a witness who said Ham appeared to be pointing a gun toward a trooper who then shot and wounded him. Another witness told investigators the boy then got up, pulled out a knife, and was shot a second time by the trooper. Police released photos of an airsoft plastic pellet gun and a small knife recovered from the scene. In Washington, D.C., gun control advocates placed 40,000 silk flowers on the National Mall Wednesday to mark the number of U.S. residents who die by shootings each year. The memorial was unveiled by Gabby Giffords, the former Arizona congresswoman who survived a gunshot to the head during a mass shooting in Tucson in 2011.
Today I struggle to speak, but I've not lost my voice. America needs all of us to speak out. We are at a crossroads. We can let the shooting continue, or we can act. we can protect our families, our future.
Former Congresswoman Gabby Gifford's husband is the new senator from Arizona, Mark Kelly. As the gun violence memorial was unveiled Wednesday, Virginia's state Senate voted to reject Governor Ralph Northam's amendment to a bill that would bar anyone convicted of assaulting a family member or housemate from owning or transporting firearms for 3 years. The governor wanted to raise the probationary period to 5 years. The United States recorded more than 75,000 new coronavirus cases Wednesday and nearly 1,000 deaths from COVID-19. Hospitalizations continue to rise in many states throughout the country, led by Michigan, even though 124 million U.S. residents are at least partially vaccinated. On Wednesday, a Centers for Disease Control panel delayed its decision on whether to resume use of Johnson & Johnson's COVID-19 vaccine after reports of extremely rare blood clots in 7 women and a man who received doses. It's not yet known if the vaccine caused the rare condition. We'll have more on that story later in the broadcast with Dr. Monica Gandhi. Several Southeast Asian countries that successfully contained the coronavirus over the past year are seeing outbreaks now. Cambodia ordered a strict 2-week lockdown of its capital, Phnom Penh, after reporting hundreds of infections per day for the first time. Fewer than 1.5 million Cambodians, or less than 5% of the population, has been vaccinated against COVID-19. Thousands Thailand's cases have risen exponentially throughout April. Meanwhile, scattered outbreaks in Vietnam are threatening one of the most successful public health campaigns of the pandemic. 175 former heads of state and Nobel laureates are calling on President Biden to back a waiver on World Trade Organization intellectual property rules for COVID-19 vaccines during the pandemic. 9 out of 10 people in most poor countries likely will not receive a vaccine this year, according to the open letter, but an IP waiver would, quote, expand global manufacturing capacity unhindered by industry monopolies that are driving the dire supply shortages blocking vaccine access. Signatories include former Liberian President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, former British Prime Minister Gordon Brown, and Nobel laureate Joe Stiglitz. Separately, a coalition of 250 groups, including Amnesty International, Public Citizen, and Doctors Without Borders, issued a similar plea to the head of the World Trade Organization. The fate of the international efforts could be decided on May 5th at the next major meeting between WTO members. Back in the United States, the House Oversight Committee has advanced a bill that would make Washington, D.C. a 51st state. The Washington, D.C. Admission Act passed out of committee on a party-line vote over unanimous Republican opposition. The full House is set to vote on the bill next week. The District of Columbia has one of the highest per capita populations of African Americans of any major U.S. city. It's home to more than 700,000 people, more than the states of Wyoming and Vermont. Yet residents have no representation in the Senate and send only a single non-voting delegate to the House of Representatives. Washington Governor Jay Inslee has signed legislation to phase out for-profit prisons and immigration jails. Under House Bill 1090, companies that contract with local, state, and federal agencies like Immigration and Customs Enforcement will be barred from renewing their existing contracts. That means one of the largest privately run immigration jails, the GEO Group's Northwest Detention Center in Tacoma, must shut down by 2025. Asylum seekers at the nearly 1,600-bed jail have repeatedly gone on hunger strike to protest squalid and dangerous conditions, including several outbreaks of COVID-19. Texas's top criminal court has thrown out the death sentence of the state's longest-serving death row prisoner. 70-year-old Raymond Riles, who's African-American, was sentenced to die for murdering a Houston used car salesman in 1974. Riles suffers from mental illness, has been repeatedly deemed too mentally incompetent to be put to death. In Pennsylvania, the imprisoned journalist Mumia Abu-Jamal is scheduled to have heart surgery today after he was rushed to the hospital with chest pains. Abu-Jamal suffers from several pre-existing conditions and lost over 30 pounds in March after becoming ill with COVID-19 in the Mahanoy State Correctional Institution. The House Judiciary Committee voted Wednesday to recommend the creation of a committee to consider reparations for slavery. The reparations bill was first proposed over 30 years ago, but never received a committee vote until this week. This is the bill's sponsor, Texas Congressmember Sheila Jackson Lee.
Do not ignore the pain, the history, and the reasonableness of this commission. This is a governmental commission, a commission that establishes the parameters of a study that provide the roadmap for the truth of the brutality and the onerous and terrible burden placed on African Americans and this nation by slavery.
And in the U.S. Senate, lawmakers advanced a bill addressing hate crimes against Asian Americans. A final vote is expected this week. Meanwhile, President Biden named Erica Muratsugu as liaison to the Asian American and Pacific Islander community. Muratsugu is of Japanese and Chinese descent, who previously worked for the Obama administration, is currently the vice president at National Partnership for Women and Families, a women's health and equity nonprofit. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the Quarantine Report. When we come back, we'll speak with Congressmember Ro Khanna about President Biden's vow to withdraw U.S. troops from Afghanistan by September 11th, ending the longest war in U.S. history. We'll also look at U.S. policy in Iran, Yemen, and more. Stay with us. Come from the music ensemble Voices of Afghanistan. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman, joined by co-host Nermeen Sheikh. Hi, Nermeen.
Hi, Amy, and welcome to our listeners and viewers across the country and around the world.
Well, President Biden has vowed to withdraw U.S. troops from Afghanistan by September 11th, the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks. Biden spoke Wednesday from the Treaty Room at the White House, the same room where President George W. Bush announced the start of the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan nearly 20 years ago, beginning what's become the longest war in U.S. history.
We cannot continue the cycle of extending or expanding our military presence in Afghanistan, hoping to create ideal conditions for the withdrawal and expecting a different result. I'm now the fourth United States president to preside over American troop presence in Afghanistan. 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats. I will not pass this responsibility on to a fifth. After consulting closely with our allies and partners, with our military leaders and intelligence personnel, with our diplomats and our development experts, with the Congress and the Vice President, as well as with Mr. Ghani and many others around the world, I've concluded that it's time to end America's longest war. It's time for American troops to come home.
President Biden went on to say the 20-year war has succeeded in preventing Afghanistan from being used again as a base to carry out attacks against the United States. He rejected arguments from critics who say it's too soon to withdraw.
So when will it be the right moment to leave? 1 more year? 2 more years? 10 more years? 10, 20, $30 billion more than the trillion we've already spent? Not now. That's how we got here. And in this moment, there's a significant downside risk to staying beyond May 1st without a clear timetable for departure. If we instead pursue the approach where America, U.S. exit, is tied to conditions on the ground, We have to have clear answers to the following questions. Just what conditions require to allow us to depart? By what means and how long would it take to achieve them, if they could be achieved at all? And at what additional cost in lives and treasure? I've not heard any good answers to these questions. And if you can't answer them, in my view, we should not stay. War in Afghanistan was never meant to be a multi-generational undertaking. We were attacked. We went to war with clear goals. We achieved those objectives. Bin Laden is dead, and al-Qaeda is degraded in Iraq and Afghanistan. And it's time to end the forever war.
On Wednesday, the Taliban threatened to target U.S. forces because Biden's reneging on a deal reached by the Trump administration to withdraw all U.S. troops by May 1st. While Biden is vowing to withdraw all troops by September 11th, the New York Times is reporting it'll unlikely be a full withdrawal. Citing former and current officials, the Times reports the United States is expected to keep relying on a, quote, shadowy combination of clandestine special operations forces, Pentagon contractors, and covert intelligence operatives inside Afghanistan. The Pentagon's has an estimated 18,000 contractors in Afghanistan. Over the past 20 years of war, 100,000 Afghan civilians have been killed, along with 45,000 members of the Afghan army and police, and at least 3,500 U.S. and coalition troops. Brown University's Cost of War project has estimated the U.S. has spent $2.3 trillion in Afghanistan. We turn right now to Congressmember Ro Khanna. Congressmember Ro Khanna has long been a critic of the Pentagon budget and also the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Your response to what Biden has done, Congressman Ro Khanna, welcome.
Thank you, Amy. It's a courageous decision. The reporting suggests that the president overruled advice from his own military boss. It is a complete withdrawal of troops, including special operation troops. Senator Sanders and I have an op-ed coming out in the Washington Post supporting the president's decision. But I am very glad that we have a president who has finally recognized that this is not a militarily winnable war, that we're spending $50 billion there, that it's leading to more deaths, as you pointed out, of Afghan civilians, and it's putting our troops at risk. So this was the right decision, and I will be standing up for it.
And Congressmember Khanna, we just learned today that Secretary of State Antony Blinken is in Afghanistan on a surprise visit. What do we know about why he's there and what kinds of discussions are ongoing? He's met with President Ashraf Ghani.
Well, I think he is probably trying to accomplish three things. First, making sure that the Taliban has a power-sharing agreement. Second, that there is a recognition of women's rights and human rights as part of that agreement. And third, making it clear that while the United States is withdrawing our troops by the September 11th deadline, that there are no attacks on troops or threats on troops, that would be extraordinarily counterproductive to our withdrawal. And my sense is that the Secretary of State is probably making those points and working towards those objectives.
Congressmember Khanna, there have been concerns expressed by some Afghans that even though this withdrawal will end the war for the U.S., it will not end the war for people in Afghanistan. In fact, it might make the conflict within the country worse, with some saying that the U.S., even as it withdraws, should support some kind of, for example, UN peacekeeping effort in the country, given that the war now is, of course, not just an internal war, but also a proxy war. Your response to that?
Well, I mean, I'm sympathetic to those concerns. Withdrawing militarily does not mean that we can stop engaging. We certainly need to be actively engaged in the diplomatic process, in the aid process, and we should be open to the idea of some United Nations presence if that's what it will take, and consider supporting such an effort. But we have an obligation after 20 years there to do all we can through non-direct military means to see that we support the Afghani people.
So in 2009, Biden, then serving as President Obama's vice president, handwrote a memo to Obama arguing for withdrawal from Afghanistan. So this is, 12 years ago. He faxed a letter to the White House from his Thanksgiving vacation on Nantucket. Obama instead chose to surge troops before eventually pulling many of them out. 2 years later, in 2011, he announced a plan to end the war in Afghanistan. This is 10 years ago.
Yet tonight, we take comfort in knowing that the tide of war is receding. Fewer of our sons and daughters are serving in harm's way. We've ended our combat mission in Iraq, with 100,000 American troops already out of that country. And even as there will be dark days ahead in Afghanistan, the light of a secure peace can be seen in the distance. These long wars will come to a responsible end.
So, again, that was President Obama 10 years ago. Of course, before that, you had Bush. Biden pointed out he doesn't want to hand this on to a fifth president. Now the war has been through 2 Republican and 2 Democratic presidents. Also, while Trump had said that all troops would be out by May 1st, Biden says the troops will begin to be pulled out by May 1st. But as we see in the New York Times, we're talking about thousands and thousands more mercenaries, intelligence people, contractors will remain in Afghanistan. Your thoughts on this, Congressman?
Well, first, Amy, President Biden's judgment on Afghanistan has been right with the clip you said. I wish we had listened to him and didn't have that surge back in 2010. Second, I do believe that the president and his team need a few months to responsibly withdraw. So the May 1st deadline that President Trump had set, I don't think President Biden should have felt obligated to meet that. September 11th seems like a reasonable goal. I do think after we have that withdrawal, we need to look into this presence of contractors, what they're doing and their role there and what more we may need to do. It's the first time learning of it based on the New York Times report. And that is something that we will investigate through the Armed Services Committee to make sure that we have withdrawn. The final point I will say is many of us supported Secretary Austin as the defense secretary. One of the reasons we supported him, despite the controversy, is we thought he would get in line with the president's decision to withdraw and not push back. And I'm glad that Secretary Austin has shown that judgment and is committed now to withdrawal.
You tweeted Tuesday, Congress should reject President Biden's Pentagon spending hike. At the same time, he's talking about pulling out of Afghanistan. You wrote, instead of continuing to increase the bloated Pentagon budgets or defense contractors, we should invest in keeping us safe from pandemics and climate change. We need a 21st century national security strategy. And you signed, along with 50 House Democrats, a letter to Biden from the Defense Spending Reduction Caucus that read in part hundreds of billions of dollars now directed to the military should have greater return if invested in diplomacy, humanitarian aid, global public health, sustainability initiatives, and basic research. So talk about Biden both announcing he will end this forever war, but increasing the Pentagon and what you think needs to happen.
I mean, the Pentagon increases make no sense. President Biden's own Secretary of Treasury describes the federal budget as military spending plus pensions. The military budget is 50% of discretionary spending. We have not seen the breakdown yet, but if you're ending the forever war in Afghanistan, as the president pointed out, that should save about $50 billion a year, then why are we increasing at the same time the defense budget? We need to look at where the numbers are being allocated and have a strategic reduction and allocate that instead in the threats that the United States faces, potential pandemics, climate change, cybersecurity. So I am going to continue to advocate on the armed services for a smart defense budget that meets the 21st century needs. One final point, we ought to be returning them to where Obama-Biden had it, which was significantly less, instead of increasing it from where Trump had it.
And Congressmember Khanna, I'd like to turn to another issue now, which you've also been very active on, and that is the war in Yemen. You joined almost 80 other Democrats urging President Biden to demand an end to the Saudi-led blockade of Yemen, telling The Nation magazine, quote, "What we've seen is that the blockade is really what's starving Yemeni children and Yemeni civilians. Right now, there's moral outrage in Congress about what's going on." Has President Biden or anyone in his administration responded to what you've said? And could you explain also Biden's promise to end all American support for offensive operations in the war in Yemen, including relevant arms sales? There have been some questions raised about what support precisely, apart from that, that President Biden has pledged to end.
Well, I mean, there's no doubt in my mind the administration needs to be doing more to stop the Saudi blockade of Yemen. There is food and medicine getting in, but that's not the point. The fuel is not getting in. Very little fuel is getting in. That is leading to great difficulty in getting the food transported to people who need them. It's leading to blackouts at hospitals. And the administration says, well, the Houthis are to blame as well. Sure, the Houthis are to blame as well. No one is saying that the Houthis are angelic actors, but David Beasley at the World Food Program, the United Nations, have said that the biggest source right now of the famine is the blockade of the fuel getting in. I spoke to the Saudi ambassador, and she said, well, we're not engaged in a blockade. We're just enforcing the UN resolution. Well, enforcing the UN resolution to prevent fuel getting in is de facto a de facto blockade. So the Saudis shouldn't be enforcing any resolution. If anything, it should be a third party. The National Security Council now is engaged on this. We are going to be receiving briefings from Lender King and others, and they know how serious the House and the Senate are about taking further actions if that blockade is not lifted.
Congressmember Khanna, even as the President Biden has said that he will stop U.S. arms sales to Saudi Arabia over what's happening in Yemen, the administration is moving ahead with more than $23 billion in weapon sales to the UAE, to the United Arab Emirates. Your response to that, given the UAE's previous involvement in the war in Yemen in supporting Saudi Arabia?
I believe it's a mistake. I don't know, and there's no evidence to suggest that they're continued to be involved militarily in the war, or for that matter, the blockade. But there are reports, and again, these are reports, that there is funding from the UAE, from the Saudis, and even from Iran still making its way into Yemen. And one of the issues that Martin Griffiths and others have said is that we have to stop any of the external funding into the Yemen civil war, or the war will never end if the groups fighting there are continuing to get support from outside. And so until the UAE stops all of that funding, and we have verification of that, until they're committed to some form of reparations to Yemen for redevelopment, I don't believe we should be affirmatively selling them more weapons.
Speaking of reparations, Tulsa is the site of one of the deadliest massacres in U.S. history. Nearly a century ago in 1921, a white mob attacked a black neighborhood in Tulsa, killing as many as 300 African Americans. Over 2 days, white mobs set fires to homes, businesses, churches in Greenwood, a thriving African American business district known as Black Wall Street. Congressman Khanna, you tweeted an article titled "Why Black Wall Street Should Be Rebuilt as a Global Capital of Black Tech," and wrote, "This is Silicon Valley's moment to prove a commitment to solving a systemic injustice. Together, we can build upon the foundation of Black Wall Street in Tulsa and invest in Black Tech Street." This is particularly relevant because you represent Silicon Valley. Also, for the first time, a committee just voted out a reparations committee bill that will be voted on the floor of the House next week. Can you talk about exactly what you're calling on the Silicon companies to do?
Amy, thank you for noticing that. First, I'm very proud that Sheila Jackson Lee's reparation bill is going to get a vote eventually in the House this time. I obviously support it. And what we need to think about is, what does it mean to have reparations? One of those views, in my opinion, is economic development. The racial wealth gap in this country has increased since the end of formalized Jim Crow. We actually have more wealth disparity between white families and black families. One of the reasons for this is the total exclusion of many black communities, black entrepreneurs, black venture capitalists from the wealth generation of the digital economy, from the wealth generation of Silicon Valley. I met a brilliant young man, Tyrants, who went to Tulsa and is now trying to make Tulsa a technology hub, attracting venture capital, attracting entrepreneurs, attracting remote workers in tech who may be leaving Silicon Valley or Boston because they can now work remotely. I would like to see all of the technology companies and venture capitalists support this young man's vision. Already we're seeing venture capital go there. But if we could rebuild Tulsa into a technology hub that is thriving with entrepreneurship, what a wonderful story that is a 21st century response to the destruction that happened with Black Wall Street.
We want to thank you so much for being with us. Ro Khanna, Democratic Congressmember from California, member of the House Armed Services Committee. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, we look at the Johnson & Johnson controversy. That's right. The CDC has paused the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. We'll look at why. We'll also talk about vaccine equity around the world and talk about masks, why they're still necessary more than ever. Stay with us.
Akuna maganangako, kuna nasa manyangako. Akuna maganangako, kuna nasa manyangako. Akuna maganangako, kuna nasa manyangako.
The leaders, believers, they know when we together, we get them. They're rebels and mighty people.
Heroes from the upcoming album Phoenix Rise, produced by Sunny Jane from Brooklyn, New York. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org. The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh. U.S. health officials have delayed a decision on whether to resume the use of Johnson & Johnson's COVID-19 vaccine after reports of extremely rare blood clots in 6 women between the ages of 18 to 48 who received doses. This is out of nearly 7 million Johnson & Johnson vaccines administered in the United States. A Centers for Disease Control panel met Wednesday and may continue the pause for 7 to 10 days. They also learned of a 7th woman and man who developed the rare condition. In this video released by the White House medical advisor Dr. Anthony Fauci explained the reason for the Johnson & Johnson vaccine pause.
A couple of reasons to do that. The first is to investigate this a bit further, and the second is to alert the clinicians out there when someone comes in with these types of symptoms to ask them if they have a history of a recent vaccination. The people who've already gotten the vaccine should not be worried because, as I mentioned, this is a very rare event, 1 in more than 1 million individuals. The J&J vaccine has been shown in clinical trials to be highly efficacious. What we're talking about now has nothing to do with the efficacy of the vaccine.
Dr. Fauci is set to testify today before the House Select Committee that oversees the government's coronavirus response, along with CDC Director Dr. Rochelle Walensky and Dr. David Kessler, Biden's chief science officer for the COVID-19 response. This comes as Biden's insisted there are still enough COVID-19 vaccines for everyone in the United States and that the pause of Johnson & Johnson vaccines won't affect immunization efforts here. This is Biden speaking Tuesday during a meeting with members of the Congressional Black Caucus.
I told you all, I made sure we have 600 million doses of the not of either Johnson & Johnson and or AstraZeneca. So there's enough vaccine that is basically 100% unquestionable for every single solitary American.
To discuss all of this and also what it means for vaccine access worldwide and more, we're joined by Dr. Monica Gandhi, infectious disease physician, professor of medicine at UCSF. That's University of California, San Francisco General Hospital. Doctor, welcome back to Democracy Now! It's great to have you with us. So let's start off with the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. One of the things that Fauci just said, Dr. Fauci said, is to alert clinicians. Now, please explain what exactly happened to these 6 or 7 or 8 people. One woman died, and we're talking about young women. We don't know if it's tied to the vaccine. But this whole issue of this rare blood clot in the brain, and I was also very interested that he said we want to alert all clinicians both to report but also to let them know that what the standard of care for blood clots is to, give heparin, a blood thinning medicine. But in this case, it has an adverse reaction, and you should not do this.
Right. So essentially, like you said, this is very rare. 6 women out of 6.8 million doses given, and perhaps these additional cases. It was, I think, prudent to just investigate these. We need to see if there was another reason for the clot. We need to see if there was any association with any other medications. And it is true that this particular syndrome, if linked to the vaccine, causes both blood thinning and blood clots. So it's thrombocytopenia, which is low platelets, and also platelets clumping. So it helps us determine what to do if someone has a headache. These are very rare clots, but they are cerebral venous sinus thrombosis, which means they're in the brain. So, this is a temporary pause. This had actually happened with the AstraZeneca vaccine, that there were clots associated with a similar type of vaccine, which is an adenovirus with a DNA inside it. And what the EU decided to do was go ahead and proceed with that vaccine, but in older individuals, because the clots weren't seen in younger individuals. That may end up being what we do here. But right now, it's just time to wait and give a week and examine it.
Dr. Gandhi, can you say what the implications of this pause are? What are the communities that were receiving the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, especially in areas where it was difficult? It's been difficult to administer Pfizer and Moderna because of how difficult it is to transport them, the conditions under which they have to be kept, as opposed to Johnson & Johnson.
Yes. I mean, Johnson & Johnson had advantages because the issue was it didn't need to be kept as cold as the Pfizer and Moderna, and it was one dose and then you were finished. And there were advantages for hard-to-reach populations, for minority communities, and specifically worldwide. There is an advantage of using an agent that is easy to transport, that's just in a refrigerator. And this is a setback and concerning. And I think that, AstraZeneca, again, we have a precedent for this with a similar vaccine. And what ended up happening was that it was paused and then resumed in the EU, at least in a certain population. And it is still ongoing in India, for example. So it may not mean this is a pause. This is not a finality, as President Biden said. We have enough doses of Moderna and Pfizer to continue at this vaccination rate of 3 million doses a day in the United States, but I'm concerned about the impact worldwide.
Dr. Gandhi, can you explain, because a lot of people, at least initially, were more skeptical of the new vaccines that are now being administered most widely in the U.S., that is the mRNA vaccines, Pfizer and Moderna, and their safety and efficacy relative to Johnson & Johnson?
Yeah, the mRNA vaccines seemed like they were a new technology, and they actually are not, in a sense that they haven't been used for pathogens anywhere, but they have been used for tumor vaccines. They've actually been around and started being developed since 2011, when we had a much, much smaller pandemic from a coronavirus called MERS. And they also were developed quickly because there was a public-private partnership, and money was put to the problem, and this was a terrible pandemic that we needed to get over. So there were lots of reasons why they were developed quickly, but they're not actually profoundly new. And so many doses have been administered now of these mRNA vaccines, and they really have been incredibly safe and profoundly effective, actually even more effective in the real world setting than we saw in the clinical trials, which is very unusual because usually the real world setting is messy and it's more diverse populations, and you didn't think that they'd be so amazingly effective in the real world setting. But study after study, including a 6-month study of the Pfizer vaccine with data released on April 1st, shows these vaccines are 100% effective across 44,000 people around the world against severe disease, and very highly effective, 98% against symptomatic COVID. So with all these administrations and how well people are doing and the safety and effectiveness, I think people are becoming very comfortable with the mRNA vaccines.
So is there something in the adenovirus, if you could explain vaccines of Johnson & Johnson, AstraZeneca, why are they both this swirl of the possibility of blood clots, though, of course, extremely, extremely rare? Why would they be causing this?
So they are different types of vaccines. So the mRNA vaccine is a piece of genetic material, called mRNA, that your body makes into the spike protein of the virus, the thing that sticks out of the virus. And the mRNA is surrounded by this lipid nanoparticle, and you inject it in the arm. The AstraZeneca and Johnson & Johnson are both similar vaccines, and they're different from the mRNA vaccines. And they actually contain a virus that's very benign. It causes colds usually, and it doesn't even replicate in our systems, called an adenovirus. And then inside the adenovirus is a coiled up DNA. And then that DNA goes into your body after you inject it. It's made by your body into mRNA, and then the same process occurs. There was a New England Journal study last week that questions whether there's a mechanism of action whereas either the DNA or the adenovirus of these two vaccines end up essentially linking and creating an antibody against platelets. Platelets are our clotting factors. So if you create an antibody against these platelets, they can clump and cause clots, and they can actually also go down in the body and cause bleeding. So there's a postulated mechanism. We've seen this with heparin, which is a blood thinner, that it can rarely cause these anti-platelet antibodies to form. And there's now a postulated mechanism, and both vaccines have caused these clots. So it's prudent to investigate this. Very rare, though.
So how will you deal with the people who are vaccine hesitant or anti-vaxxers altogether? You've got the person leading the charge, the Fox News host, Tucker Carlson. It is the most watched cable news show in history, so it's extremely significant. He sees the opportunity of the Johnson & Johnson pause to suggest the U.S. government is likely downplaying the alleged danger and lying about the efficacy of COVID-19 vaccines.
According to the CDC's new guidance, once you've been vaccinated, you still cannot, quote, attend medium or large gatherings. The federal health authorities also recommend that you continue to wear your mask when you go outside. How long will this continue? Well, according to Yahoo News, experts say it's, quote, not entirely clear when it will be considered okay for people who are fully vaccinated to stop wearing masks. At some point, no one's asking this, but everyone should be. What is this about? If vaccines work, why are vaccinated people still banned from living normal lives? Honestly, what's the answer to that? It doesn't make any sense at all. If the vaccine is effective, there is no reason for people who have received the vaccine to wear masks or avoid physical contact. So maybe it doesn't work, and they're simply not telling you that.
So, Dr. Monica Gandhi, I think we can call you the masked madam. You are a very serious proponent of masks. Why do you say that it doesn't indicate failure? And also, let's be clear that the vaccine hesitant or anti-vax movement goes across the political spectrum.
Yes, actually, the CDC has given guidance that indicates that when people can stop wearing their masks. And the guidance is vaccinated people around vaccinated people and vaccinated people around unvaccinated individuals of low risk, like children who are not at risk for severe disease. The CDC has also given guidance about travel with vaccinated people. And actually, this is the right thing to do because it increases vaccine optimism when you tell people that we're going to eventually get back to normal life without masks and distancing once we can get more of our population vaccinated. So there is a point to be said that eventually we are going to get back to the normalcy of not masking and distancing. We're just in this twilight period right now because we are not fully vaccinated. And in fact, there are people desperate to get the vaccine who have not yet had the chance to get the vaccine. So we're in a transition phase right now. Actually, a very good thing to look at is Israel and the UK, which have had faster vaccination programs than we. And Israel has gradually been easing their restrictions. They're at 60% first dose given now. And they keep on gradually easing their restrictions and lockdowns. And things are getting more and more normal. This is where we will get to if we can get enough people to take the vaccine. And the UK just released major lockdowns on April 12th. So I think it is actually important to say that the goal of vaccinations is not to stay in this state of masking, distancing, and out of normal life. But we do need a temporary state, just a temporary state now, where those of us who are vaccinated are respectful to those of us who are not unvaccinated. You don't know what's going on in a store. You don't know who's vaccinated or unvaccinated. And we're still staying with masks and distancing for now.
Dr. Gandhi, you mentioned earlier that these mRNA vaccines are even more effective in real-world settings than they were in clinical trials. But we still see in the U.S., despite the fact that the U.S. has administered more doses of vaccine than anywhere else in the world, we still see very high rates of infection in certain areas. So could you explain this, vaccines versus what people attribute some of these rises in cases to, variants?
So, yes. So what happened, and again, I look to Israel and the UK as examples of places that have gone faster, is that if you started with high case rates, and you haven't tamped down transmission enough, the vaccine itself can't bring down cases until you've gotten to a certain vaccination rate. So what happened in Michigan and other states as we were rolling out vaccine is the vaccine wasn't catching up fast enough to the fact that there was still ongoing case transmission. And unfortunately, there were increased cases, hospitalizations in these areas. This isn't true across the entire United States. If you started with a lower case rate, like in California, where I live, then the vaccines have been profoundly effective and have kept cases very low. So I compare this to Israel. Israel actually had a surge in cases after they started rolling out vaccines because the lockdowns were more permissive than in the UK, and the UK didn't have that surge. Now, in terms of variants, this is a very important point. Variants may B117, the variant that's in the UK and now also in the upper Midwest, actually is more transmissible. Luckily, we had data just the other day, very well done studies in Lancet Public Health and Lancet Infectious Disease from England, that they are not more virulent. It's just that if they move faster and you don't have enough of your population vaccinated, you can't keep up until you get enough vaccination in the population and you maintain your masks and distancing. However, the most important point about variants is, will our vaccines not work against variants? And the one thing that I want to clear up for our audience is that it's a very clear message, actually. There are two arms of the immune system. It's very simple. There are antibodies, which are more temporary arms of the immune system. And then there's a fundamental arm of the immune system that are most effective against viruses. And that's called cell-mediated immunity, or T cells. All of these vaccines induce T cells. The reason we know that is they actually measured these T cells in the clinical trials. They're actually very complicated to measure. They take fancy machines. They're hard to measure, but they took the time to measure T cells in the clinical trials. They all rise appropriately. And indeed, the T cells are effective against all the variants. This is a paper by NIAID, Dr. Fauci's organization, that he messaged at the White House Task Force meeting a couple of weeks ago by Dr. Red. There's another paper by Dr. Sethi that shows that even if you get the mRNA vaccine and you have are exposed to a variant, that your T cells stay active against that variant. So I think long term we will be able to get out of this coronavirus pandemic with these vaccines if we concentrate on our T-cell immunity. So I'm actually not worried about the worst thing that can happen with variants, which is that they evade our immune response.
Dr. Gandhi, you've also advocated a first dose, first strategy, which was, of course, employed in the UK extremely controversially at the time. Could you explain what the advantages of that strategy are? And you mentioned also, so that's one. Second, you mentioned earlier that there are people who are desperate for the vaccine who've not been able to get access to it. Could you talk about that in particular with respect to people in poorer countries, the majority of whom are not expected to get the vaccine anytime this year and possibly for several years?
Yes, the idea around first dose first is that you'll give the second dose eventually, but that you delay the time between doses. There are actually great reasons for this. Number one, there was no reason that we had to do 3 to 4 weeks with Pfizer and Moderna respectively. That was just to expedite the trials. Actually, vaccinology has taught us that the longer between doses, the better. It actually gives you more of an immune response. For example, hepatitis B vaccine, we used to give doses sooner, and then we realized we had more immune responses if we give them longer. If you remember childhood vaccinations, we don't care if children come in a little late for their vaccines. We care if they come in too early. And then the most important reason is we've seen the UK strategy, and they have delayed the second dose till 12 weeks. And there have been no implications for that, no emergence of variants. And in fact, they've gone much faster, and they have very low cases in the UK, and again, are opening up more. So I genuinely believe that the first dose, first strategy would get more of our population vaccinated. We could bring immunity to more of our population, and then we can give the second dose later. The reason it's so important for the global equity question that you just asked is that right now we're in this strange position where we have a global pandemic and we're not working hard enough to get global equity to the vaccines. If you give first dose first, you can have more people just fundamentally get more of the first dose, which is up to 80 to 92% effective. And second is that we will never get to complete safety from COVID-19 unless we do whatever it is in our power to increase global equity to the vaccines. And there are various ways to do that.
And speaking of vaccine apartheid, Amnesty just criticized Israel last week for not providing vaccines to Palestinians, saying the move flagrantly violates Israel's obligations as an occupying power under international law. Very significant because, as you point out, Israel's often used as the gold standard when it comes to its population in Israel proper. But what's devastating is what's happening to the Palestinians in the occupied territories. Dr. Monica Gandhi, I want to thank you so much for being with us, infectious disease physician and professor of medicine at UCSF. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh. Stay safe. Wear a mask.